Hello, friends, and welcome to the City of the Immaculata, a channel where we discuss various topics of history and theology. If you enjoy these videos, please take a second to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment if you have any thoughts on the subject. Today we begin our series on the Reconquista. This lecture is the first video in a three-part series we are doing. Part 2 is going to be called The Rise of the Christian Knights of Spain. Part 3 is going to be called The Return of the King and Queen. And the first video today that we'll be looking at is called The Last Remnant of Christian Spain. Some points to consider. We're going to be using the Reconquista as a proxy for the wider discourse on Islamic and Christian relations in the Middle Ages. Maybe at the end of the last lecture, I'll reflect a little bit on moving into modernity a little bit, what that's, but we just recently wrapped up a series of videos on Jews in the church in the Middle Ages, and I wanted to do something similar for the question of Islam in the church in the Middle Ages, but it's a much different subject. The Jews were at times a minority living in Christian Europe, while Muslims were a little bit more of a peripheral problem along specific borders, whether you lived in the borders of Spain and France, whether you lived in the borders in the Far East of Europe. So it's not a one-to-one comparison. And I thought that by picking the Reconquista of Spain, it might act as a proxy to have this discussion on Islam and the church in the Middle Ages. And so I want to make these three lectures. It's going to largely be a discourse on the history of the two, but there's also going to be some discussions of theology and some of the interplay, just as we did in the previous series on Jews in the church. Now, we're going to want to keep a close eye on the maps of this period. There's a lot of fluctuation, especially at key moments. And I don't have as many maps, I don't believe, in this lecture, but moving forward, it's going to be something that you're going to want to keep an eye on because the map is going to change a lot on us, and there's significance in this discussion of Spain in the Middle Ages relative to the Christian population and the Muslim population. And we're going to be ending up with modernity, as I said, much like we did with the previous lecture, mostly because once you get into modernity, things start to get a little bit more complicated. I would say all across the board, the situation between Islam and the church is simpler than what it was with the Jews in the church, but again, that's relative. And it's once you get into modernity, some of these things they just get so scattered and fragmented that it's much more difficult to keep a cohesive narrative that would lend itself to a broad scope lecture like these are going to be. So those are the points to consider for this. Now let's move into the topic. And I think it's important before we really begin this lecture to establish where we're at in history. Often in the story of the rise of Islam, in particular, the narrative usually begins with their explosive, violent expansion out of the Near East and then picks up and carries on from there. But when we do this, we fail to acknowledge that there were entire cultures that were often immediately and permanently snuffed out in the process. Such is the case of Visigothic Spain. There was, in fact, when the Muslims conquered it, a centuries-old, fully developed Christian culture in the Iberian Peninsula that was vibrant, that was interesting, and as we'll see, that was ultimately, unfortunately, very vulnerable. The origins of Christian Spain follow a long trajectory from orthodoxy to Arianism, back to a very hard-fought orthodoxy. It's a fantastic story in and of itself. I don't think it should be lost in this. And if you guys have time and interest, I would recommend go and look at that ancient community of Spaniards before the conquest of the Muslims. Ethnically, the people were of a Roman Germanic origin. They came to inhabit the region not long before the fall of the Roman Empire. So by the time of our history, centuries later, it's a firmly established culture. Culturally mature, religiously unified, and as rightfully inhabitants of its land as any early medieval kingdom could claim. By 711, the period in question here, Christian Visigothic Spain was not some chaotic, ill-informed barbarian outpost in flux, as you may imagine some places of Europe were after the fall of the empire. It was a settled, sovereign Christian state with 120 years of deliberate cultural synthesis behind it. It had produced a unique Hispano-Visigothic identity that blended Roman continuity, elite Germanic traditions, and Orthodox Catholicism. Had it survived, it certainly would have been the study and wonder of Christians the world over. Because of what happens, though, it is largely treated as a footnote by modern historians who tend to overly focus on the Al-Andalus. So these are deeply Catholic, heavily Romanized Germanic Goths who would have spoke Latin, who were staunchly in communion with the church. This is a civilized people who should never just be casually brushed over when you cover these topics. As far as the church's presence in Visigothic Spain, there were numerous dioceses and sees, especially those that we're aware of. We believe there might even have been more than what we're aware of. Visigothic Spain is responsible for some very important synods in Toledo, 18 of them between the years 400 and 702. But while all of this is true, there's also going to be some serious cracks, some weaknesses, as there are in any time and place, that the Muslim invaders would capitalize on when they arrived. But before we get to their arrival, I want to do a survey of the emergence of Islam, which is a novel religion by the time of our story. So much so that you get the sense that the Christians of the day, writing about it, whether in Damascus or North Africa or Europe, are at a loss to fully grasp what's going on and who these people are. Maybe the first really good expose on Islam we have is from St. John of Damascus in his work on heresies, where he rightly, in my opinion, identifies Islam as a distinct Christian heresy, which would be the standard position of the church moving forward. The standard origin story goes as such. It begins with the quasi-political and spiritual emergence of a caravan trader in the Arabian desert known as Muhammad. In 610, Muhammad's first revelation of the Quran, the recitation by the angel Gabriel, he says, begins to take place. He is as I said, a trader by profession, and he's known as a very spiritual man, and he goes up into these caves in the deserts, and he says that he's greeted by the angel Jabril, as he would call them. And Jabril begins to recite these messages that he says is from Allah, Arabic for God. And these messages would continue until 632, and they would come to make up the religious text of Islam known as the Quran. 613, Muhammad begins preaching in the town of Mecca. Mecca at this time is run by a group called the Quraysh, who control something of a temple or a monument in the center of the city known as the Kaaba, which is a place where all of the various pagan tribes of the region would annually make pilgrimage to, and it said that all of the different idols to the various gods were represented within this temple. And so it's a very powerful city. The Quraysh is a very powerful group. And Muhammad comes there to preach a message of the oneness of God and to show that submission to God is paramount, and that all of these other acts and all of these other idols are a blaspheme to the one God. In 622, after his preaching he begins to gain followers, and he comes to the ire of the Quraysh, so he has to flee Mecca for another city known as Medina. And it's an interesting fact that in Islam, the year one, the Hijrah, we define year one in Christianity in the West as the date of the birth of our Lord, Anno Domini. But for Muslims, year one is not the birth of their prophet, nor even the first of his revelations. Rather, it is here the year of what's known as the Hajj, the move from Mecca to Medina. And that's going to have some major historical significance for Muslims up to this very day. It would set the stage for their global design to expand out and move to new lands for their faith. Now, eventually, there's going to be a lot of political maneuvering on the part of Muhammad and his followers, and open hostility breaks out, but he will, by 630, conquer the city of Mecca without battle. He's the undisputed ruler of the entire Arabian desert by the time of his death, and they begin expanding outward, but he ends up not being able to finish that project. Muhammad's project goes unfinished. It is suggested in the Hadith literature that he may have been poisoned. Now, after Muhammad dies, there is a series of successions for who will be the ruler. Since Muhammad didn't actually have any heirs, as none of his wives bore him a direct son. Now, there were some logical claimants, but the major body of his followers, those today known as the Sunni, went on to elect the next in line. Now, you have to bear in mind When Muhammad dies, he's not just a religious leader. Some historians more recently contend he may not even in reality have been primarily a religious leader. Regardless of which it is, though, at the time of his death, he's undeniably a military leader at the head of an army that is beginning to gain its confidence when as it wins one victory after another. Those armies would capitalize on and sustain that momentum that Muhammad began to amazing success. And in the wake of these successions comes what's known as the caliphate. The caliphate, the idea which emerges in Islam of an empire, a unified empire of the followers of Muhammad, led and guided by the emperor, the successor, the caliph. The first four of these are known as the rightly guided ones. They include Abu Bakr, who's Muhammad's general. He's chosen by the army, as we said. He's elected, and this is going to be the origins of the Sunni sect of Islam. There's also I believe the third in line, Ali Talib. He's Muhammad's son-in-law. He's recognized as among the Sunni as the one of the rightly guided ones, but there's going to be a break-off sect from Muhammad's son-in-law, a group that wants to see it more as a hereditary claim to become the followers of Ali, and that will be the origins of the Shiite sect. So the first of the four grand caliphs were known as the Rashidun caliphs, the rightly guided ones. And they're going to be followed up by a hereditary dynasty known as the Umayyad, which lasted from 661 to 750. They're centered in Damascus, and it is through them that we get these lightning quick victories across Persia, North Africa, and eventually, as we're going to see, into Spain. Their victories in this period tend to astonish newcomers to this history, but there is a reason for it. So here we have a map of North Africa, but if you were to go just to the right of it, just to the east, and if you look at Arabia, Arabia is almost, but not quite, sandwiched between the two great empires of its day, Christian Byzantium with its capital in Constantinople, and the Persian Sassanid Empire further east. And these two great powers had just concluded a decades-long, horrible war of attrition that left both empires weakened and depleted, and they were both ripe to be picked off, as it were. And it just so happens that this scourge comes out of the desert and takes advantage of the situation. Now, North Africa, largely at this point, is still part of the Byzantine Empire. Essentially, it just folds. It just drops like a house of cards. These raiders, they come on camelback. The Bedouins come on camelback. And they come not as vindictive conquerors, not as sadistic barbarians. They came with fairly diplomatic terms. They said, we'll let you keep your administrative structures in place, and we'll just levy a tax, the jizya. And you can no longer publicly proclaim your faith, but you as a 21st century Christian may be asking, how did this centuries-old Christian communities of Egypt and North Africa, how did they agree to all of this? Well, the truth is, the Monophysite Christians, as they were known, had also been in a centuries-long religious conflict between themselves and the Orthodox Chalcedonian Christians. And there's going to be this centuries-long back and forth dispute between the Monophysites and the Chalcedonian Christians, and it's typically an argument taking place between Alexandria and Constantinople. And one side at some point has the upper hand, and then the other side gets the upper hand. Well, by this point, Constantinople is run by the Chalcedonian Christians, and the emperor's a Chalcedonian Christian, and there's just a lot of severe resentment on both sides. And as it were, when these camel riders came with the conditions they came with, it was better on the Monophysites in their mind that they be, dare I say, subjected to the turban of the Bedouin rather than the mitre of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So this is why they would capitulate so easy. And as you can see here on the map, they sweep across North Africa. They take Carthage in 698, Altava in 708, Tingi and Morocco in 708, and there they sat, looking across the Straits of Gibraltar at Christian Visigothic Spain. How they come to possess Spain is a varied story event in itself. What happens is a Visigothic king in the early 8th century was a guy named Roderick. Now, Roderick was not the nicest nor the most virtuous of men. Roderick was known if he would find a young senorita that he fancied, he would basically tell the family of the girl that he's going to take the girl for himself. Not to make an honest woman of her, mind you, not to marry her and place upon her all the prestige of royalty, but rather to have her as a lowly servant who offers him sexual favors, typically until he's done with her, and then she's publicly marked as a used woman. So not a great proposition for the families, as you can imagine. So what happens is there's a vassal of the king down in the southern part of the country, and Roderick takes an eye for this vassal's daughter. And he tells the vassal, considered at this point something of a low nobility, they take the lower nobility take a lot of pride in their family, and honor is everything for them because their status is in that transitionary place where they could easily become lower class were something to go bad for them. Well, Roderick tells this vassal, hey, I'm going to take your daughter up to Toledo, and I'm going to give her an education. And then she can come back with the kinds of administrative skills that you guys lack here, giving your family a head start among the provinces and the emerging nobility down here. Father says, fine, sounds like a good deal. There's only one problem, though. The daughter does go to Toledo, and she winds up not only getting educated, but she also winds up getting pregnant. And the father is furious. Meanwhile, as we noted, word that these strange, fierce camel riders have reached the tip of Moroccan North Africa. Word going around is that they're pretty decent in their treatment of the conquered. They offer some good deals. Oh, and by the way, word also comes to them that they kind of have their eyes on the prize of Spain. And who wouldn't? You're an Arab posted in the God-forsaken deserts of North Africa, and you're looking across the Mediterranean at Spain's luscious hills and grasslands. Of course you'd want to be there. Now, the Muslim leader of North Africa was a man named Musa ibn Nasir. And Musa had a hard time keeping control and command of his subordinates. They were, as you can imagine, flushed with victory, looking to add win upon their wins. One in particular, a charismatic leader named Tariq ibn Zayed, pictured here on the left, was especially hard to control. Well, now, all of a sudden, this opportunity arises where this Christian vassal, mad at Roderick and the humiliation his family had received, is offering to bring across a division of Tariq's men. And it's a win-win for him. The vassal gets his revenge for his daughter's humiliation, and Tariq, this maverick lieutenant, gets an assignment that's far away, that's essentially like a suicide mission. It would have been hard for anyone to imagine the success that they were about to have. So Tariq, in secret, even from his commander Musa, begins negotiations with the Christian Spaniard. And sure enough, in the cover of night, under the guise of being a caravan trader, Tariq's men are ferried across the Straits of Gibraltar by the vassal, and he proceeds within 3 short years to destroy the entire Visigothic kingdom. One battle after another, the Spanish Christians are overwhelmed and defeated. The entirety of Visigothic Spain is wiped out. And in a turn that's every bit as astonishing, it appears that Tariq's armies may even have been able to break through into the Frankish kingdoms to the north. There is one place, though, in the Iberian Peninsula that becomes ever the thorn in the side of the Islamic governors in those first years. Spain consists of a lot of hilly, yes, a lot of mountainous, yes, terrain, but not stoppable terrain for a mobile, committed army to navigate, coordinate, and execute the kind of complex maneuvers that Tariq's men had managed to do. Especially when you have the initial force, the rush of momentum as the Islamic armies of North Africa come pouring in. And this momentum is eventually going to exhaust itself when it reaches the far north of Spain and a mountain range known as the Asturias. The Asturias, I have heard it described once as like Seattle. It's just rainy all the time, and the people are always depressed. And that's a bit facetious, of course, but it plays well into the Christian hands because ultimately, while it's technically now under Islamic authority, the Muslims never really bothered with it too much. They had everything that they needed south of the Asturias, south of the Cantabrian Mountains. Now let's look geographically at where we are. The Asturias, sandwiched between this mountain range known today as the Cantabrian Mountains, and on the northern side of them, the Bay of Biscay. So in the picture to the right, toward the north side of the mountains, you can see some green. That's where most of the population would have been found, hugging against the Bay of Biscay there. And who was this population? Joseph F. O'Callaghan, in his work, The History of Medieval Spain, says that it's largely remnants of both the elite and the peasantry of Visigothic Spain. Now, the elite factor will be very important as it provides the immediate, unbroken aristocracy from the Romano world to this new situation, this new world. O'Callaghan says that as the Muslims were advancing north, they're pushing these Hispano-Gothic nobility ever further into the Asturias, into the Septimania. And it was this class, this noble class, who were the going to become the constant bane of the Muslims as they'd harass them in these little guerrilla skirmishes rather than fight them head on. They would provoke and harass the Muslim armies, and then they'd vanish up into the hills. Very unsportsmanlike conduct as far as the Muslims were concerned, but it fared the Christians well. And these little skirmishes were about to break out into a full-blown rebellion. And to get to that, we must discuss King Pelayo. What to say about Pelayo? I could do a whole video on him, Oh, wait, I already did. In my Amazing Saint series, you can find a video titled Our Lady of Covadonga, or what is it called? Covadonga, when Our Lady stopped the Islamic advance. But I did that as more of a hagiographic story, so let's get into what we know here. First off, keep in mind that all of Visigothic Spain is kaput at this point. Even the Asturias is de jure under Muslim rule. There is some evidence that Pelayo was a Visigoth, a nobleman by birth, that he had offered his sister in marriage to one of the Muslim governors as a sort of consolidation of the legitimacy of his territory. A couple of the chroniclers suggest this. Now, this fact may come as a shock or a disappointment to some of you, and I want to address something for a minute here related to that. We tend to look back on history through the lens of all that comes after it. What I mean by that is that vassalage and servitude were the name of the game in those days. And it mattered little if you were under this Christian lord or under this vali, this Muslim governor. If you were weaker, you tended to go ahead and pay your tributes and just get on with things. And also, if you were of some noble birth, it benefited you to offer the women in your family in marriage in exchange for alliances and protection. Now, we want to view this Reconquista as this continuous, centuries-long, unbroken struggle of the Christian prince against the Muslim emir, but it just wasn't that way. And I'm going to stress this point. Most people aren't stepping back from the immediate context of their circumstances and thinking about, hey, is this thing that I'm doing right now, is it part of an arc that will stretch far, centuries into the future? That's not how you think, and that's not how they would have thought. Typically, people will just go on with the status quo until things either change progressively over time, or until things become intolerable, or until some opportunity arises where the right person or the right people are there to seize upon it. For Pelayo, it is not clear whether it's the former or the latter, but it does seem that somewhere between the initial conquest and a willingness to become a vassal, he has a change of heart. And he begins to encourage other nobles of the region to stop paying the jizya tax and to start harassing the Saracens. So he's eventually going to be elected by the nobles to lead the men of the Asturias. There's a small remnant, as we said, of these nobles that are living up in the north in Pelayo. Pelayo, it's the Romanized version, the Latinized version of his name is going to be one you would probably recognize, the name Pelagius. So he becomes the de facto leader, and from here we get the first rumblings of a true Christian resistance and pushback. The way this leads to conflict is super interesting. What happens is that, flushed with all their success, the Muslims, as I said, continue to eye the northeast into modern day France, the Francia, the kingdom of the Franks to the north. And they wanted to penetrate the heartland of the European continent. And to do this, they would have to cross the Pyrenees and take on the Germanic tribal people just on the other side. It's easy enough, right? They've been successful in everything they've done up to this point. Well, not so much. In 721, forces under the Vali, Anbasa ibn Saim al-Kabi, march over the Pyrenees and are beaten soundly at the Battle of Toulouse by Otto the Great. And this was in fact the first major blow any Islamic army had faced since the time of Muhammad. they had up to this point seemed invincible, Otto broke that veneer and was being heralded all over Europe as a hero, including by Pope Gregory II. Well, Al-Kabi is licking his wounds as he's crossing back into Iberia, and he now has the prospect of going back to Cordoba and telling his superiors there, hey guys, well, I just lost a major battle, and oh, by the way, the army's morale is totally in the dumps now. So he's thinking of his options. He's coming back into Iberia, and he looks over to his west and thinks to himself, you know what? I may be able to brunt some of the abuse I'm going to receive for this little failure if I were to detour and go over into the Cantabrian and give these unruly rebels a quick whipping before I go back south. That may soften the blow I'll receive when the news of my loss gets to the governors down there. Well, word of this massive Islamic army headed their way reaches the men of the Asturias, and there's a moment of panic. In this panic, Pelayo heads up into the hills of a mountain called Covadonga, and there he comes across a statue in a cave. This statue, known to us today as Our Lady of Covadonga, was said to have been left in the cave by a monk years earlier who had been fleeing the Islamic advance. He knew that the iconoclast Saracen infidels would have smashed the statue had he left it for them to find, so he hides it in this cave where word of it spreads and it becomes a local shrine. Now, I like to imagine Pelayo at this moment, faced with pressure, the kind of pressure most men will never understand nor feel, walking into this cold, damp cave, sound of the waterfall outside rushing, trickles of water glistening coming down the walls of the cave, the smell of the air in a wet mountainous cave. I'd like to picture him in his full, noble, kingly, knightly uniform coming up to this tiny little statue of Our Lady and there in his moment of desperation, kneeling and praying. And it's a phenomenal image to think about. You can still go to the location to this day. I have a picture of it here to the left, and I recommend if you're ever traveling northern Spain to do. They built this little beautiful church into the side of the mountain in the place where Pelayo would have gone to pray that day. Our Lady speaks to him, and she tells him that he will be victorious in her name. So Pelayo goes to prepare his men. The question is, how are they going to defeat this army? The odds are terrible. Some of the Christian sources have the Asturians outnumbered 100 to 1, and even more in some accounts. Also, the Muslims, despite their recent losses, were battle-tested and hardened. Pelayo, with the few leftovers of the old Visigothic nobility who had managed to survive, he decides on a action which would become known in Spain as their standard model for defense when things get tough, what we would call today guerrilla warfare. What he does is quite brilliant, in fact, on par with Hannibal's destruction of the Romans at Trasimene. He decides it best to use the rugged, inhospitable terrain to the maximum advantage. Through a series of small skirmishes, he manages to lure al-Kababi into a narrow pass. The Muslim army, despite its numerical advantage, takes the bait and allows themselves to be bottlenecked into this pass with imagine these massive rugged cliffs on either side of you. And the Christians are up in the cliffs waiting. And when the men get deep enough, when the Muslim army was deep enough into the pass, it was hammered into these Christians They needed the discipline to wait until the army was well advanced into the pass. And once they were sufficiently in, the Christians began barreling down on them everything at their disposal. Arrows, rocks, boulders. It was a complete and total rout. And in the panic to push backwards to back out of the pass, the Saracen lines became clogged and ultimately trapped. It said that they were so panicked and disarrayed that when trying to retreat, they were flung off of a cliff into a ravine. Some chroniclers say this alone led to thousands and thousands of Muslim soldiers dying. So it's one of the most humiliating defeats in recorded history, and the result is clear. The Christian lines became the Cantabrian Mountains, north of which, from this point forward, the Muslims would consider really not worth their trouble. South of that, though, is basically what is going to become the Umayyad Caliphate. So in the north, the Asturias, this is what's left to stand. And it is from this tiny strip, as you can see here in the image, that tiny little purple strip way up in the north, with the Bay of Biscay at their backs, surrounded, that the Christian Visigothic world survived, and the kingdom of Asturias is born. Now, what can we say about this quote-unquote kingdom from the outset? Well, it's hardly the organized Christian polity that we may want. As we're going to see, especially in the next lecture, it is mostly a fragmented, disjointed, warring series of families and connections which almost fortuitously rather than intentionally over the centuries coalesce into a unified Christian front. But it's a long time getting there. King Pelayo dies in 737. Before he dies, he marries off one of his daughters, Ermesinda, to a Cantabrian nobleman named Alfonso. It is these types of marriages and the alliances that come with them which will, over time, begin to consolidate Christian power. But again, it's excruciatingly incremental. Alfonso is going to be important. It is through him that a dynastic legacy really begins to take shape. In 740, there is a Berber revolt in Tangier, which spreads up into Iberia. Now, I have to stop here just for a moment to interject yet another factor you are going to want to be mindful of as we move forward. It is the ubiquitous tendency of the rulers of this time to botch a good thing. The whole concept of wresting defeat from the jaws of victory, I think it has to come from this period. And it's both sides, it's Muslim and Christian. You're going to find over and over again that Muslims miss the chance to once and for all end the Christian resistance because of their incessant fighting with each other. And the same goes for the Christians. Now, the Christians aren't really going to have an opportunity this early on to make any sort of, dare I say, effective. There's no chance that they're going to actually completely wipe out the Muslims at this point. But any chance that they have at solidarity and offering a unified resistance is also going to be squandered over and over again. And the Muslims, who actually, in theory, do have a chance to, at times, to wipe out the small Christian remnants, is ever unable to because of this tendency to fight with each other. More often than not, in fact, we're going to find Christian leaders making alliances with Muslims leaders, making alliances with Christians, and those Christians are oftentimes making alliances with Muslims, not against other Muslims, but against other Christians. And those Muslims are oftentimes making alliances with Christians, not against other Christians, but against other Muslims. So it's a sad fact for us as Christians. We're looking at this, but it's one that we have to contend with nonetheless. Okay, so there. Okay, so this revolt of the Berbers against the Arabs diverts Muslim attention enough that Alfonso is able to begin this process of what would be known as repoblacion or repopulation. What he would do is he would bring his forces right up to the edge of these Muslim occupied cities. Knowing that the Islamic leaders are tied up elsewhere, the nobles of these cities would abandon them in the face of Alfonso's presence. Then, in the wake of these depopulated towns, Alfonso would bring in his own nobles and peasants and monks, and they would effectively come to occupy the cities. So before it was over, Alfonso completely had retaken the regions of Galicia and Leon. Following Alfonso, you get a period of what is known, ironically, by lazy historians as lazy kings. I say that because I find it a bit of a misnomer because on the surface, it sounds like what we're saying is that the kings just sat around and didn't do anything, like they're like gluttonous, lazy rulers. But that's not what it is. Instead, what it refers to is just the fact that the kings of this period, some of them are quite energetic, but they're just not so much interested in increasing territory. Rather, they're interested in consolidating the territory that they have gained, often against the encroachment of other rival Christian claimants. Now, one interesting thing that happens early in this Asturias period is that during the reign of King Aurelius was that there was a Christian slave rebellion. What would happen is that a king like Aurelius here would offer Christian girls as ransoms to Muslim slave traders, basically in exchange, it's like a extortion, a tribute to not harass them or in exchange for some kind of protection. And this was part of a general non-aggression policy of the kings towards those on the southern border. Now, these kinds of exchanges were commonplace in Visigothic Spain. As we said, King Roderick took for himself a vassal's daughter. But it seems like at this point that the climate's changing. It's one thing to have your daughters traded off to other Christians. It's quite another to have lost them totally to this infidel faith. So this so-called cause of the freedmen is, in my opinions, some of the first rumblings we see of a popular sentiment towards the neighbors to the south, where despite what many rulers may want to contend with and what many rulers may be satisfied with, the move from master slave to a feudal society that's underway at this point, I think acts as a locus or a focal point for what we're later going to identify as this front against Muslim occupation. So I want to change trajectory for a bit and focus on Islam as a religion. Because it is one thing to make assumptions about people being conquered by a foreign entity and what that entity brings with it and what it forces upon the occupied nation, and as it is with one like Islam, a desire to not just invade, not just occupy, but to truly manage to conquer, to pull people into this new thing. And so Islam, being what I say is effectively a political body that just happens to have a religion tied to it, is wildly successful at slowly undermining and gnawing away at whatever the host faith is, whatever the native faith is that they of the region that they've just conquered, and over time, really through sheer attrition alone, eliminate the native religion and place it with its own. And I believe that it is within the religio-political that we find the answer for why, for example, the Visigothic Christian world died to be replaced by this new thing, the Al-Andalus, which we will get to. So we're going to do a side-by-side comparison of Christianity with Islam to help you guys wrap your minds around some of the similarities and some of the differences. To start with, let's make a comparison of how tradition works in Islam. Oh, before I get started, I just want to say this is a broad overview. Before the experts in Islamic theology are in the comments, say, okay, look, I know you're out there. You guys always are. Here's the thing. We're very fortunate, for the most part, in the Catholic Church because when it comes to defining who we are, what we believe, it's super easy to do for reasons that we'll be discussing here. For something like Islam, forget about it. It's almost a useless term if you really want to press the subject because for almost every positive thing I could say about Islam, there's some culture or some body of scholars or some individual or whatever, whomever, who will disagree with or not fit the standard. So this is really okay. Let me try to take a snapshot of Orthodox, in quotes, Orthodox Islam, and make some very general statements about what they believe and what they are held to, especially the kind of Muslim who would have come to occupy Iberia. But if you really want to get pedantic, of course, someone in theory could be considered a Muslim and believe very few of these things that we'll be looking at over the next few slides. Okay, so there's that. I have learned from experience I need to make those disclaimers. I'll probably still have the comments, but that's what it is. Written tradition. So I thought this is helpful. It would give an idea. You guys know, or you should be familiar with a little bit more of what we have in the Catholic Church. So we're going to make a comparison of that with what we find in Islam. So with written tradition, of course, in Christianity, we have the Old and New Testaments, which we believe are inerrant without any errors. We say God is the author of Scripture, but it's not like God pens Scripture itself. He uses the talents of various men over the course of centuries to use their own God-given natural abilities to. That's why when you read various works of Scripture, Old and New Testaments, you're clearly reading hands of different men, though they are all saying there's nothing in Scripture that God wanted to say that is not said in there. As I said, it's a series of books written over centuries by these various men. The Quran, on the other hand, is considered continued revelation of God. Muslims, by and large, accept the validity of the fact that there is an Old and New Testament, but they consider them corrupted. They consider the uncorrupted, in theory, uncorrupted Old and New Testaments as revelation, but this is the continued, the final, and the most perfect revelation of God. It too, like Scripture, is inerrant. God is the author, but he's the author in the immediate sense, not in the proximate sense that we're talking about with sacred Scripture. Muhammad merely recites what is told to him by the angel of Gabriel. And depending on which school of Islam that you're coming from, they'll take various degrees of what this means. But some of them will go so far as to say that the Quran is almost like an attribute of God itself, like an infinite. There is, like, the Quran has always existed. And so there's some logical problems with that, but the whole idea there is that it's not this cooperation of man with God. It's merely Muhammad is the passive receiver of the words that he's hearing. The Quran then is going to be memorized by his followers. Muhammad would teach it to his followers. The followers would memorize it, and they're going to recite it for the first several decades or so until it's collected by the Caliph Uthman. And what Uthman does is he has a sort of standardized version of the Quran, in these sort of, if you're an Orthodox Muslim, you believe there would be bastardized versions destroyed. If you're more of giving it more of a historical critical approach, you would say that he probably just, there was variance in the memorization and the oral tradition that was, as it was handed down. But be that as it may, what we have that survives with very few exceptions is going to come through this line of Othman. As far as traditions being passed down, in the church, we of course we have the teachings of the apostles. We say that the church, there's two methods in which the apostles, this what we would call in Catholicism the deposit of faith that was handed down to us. The inerrant deposit of faith was both oral and written. It lasted through the life of the apostles. It ends with the death of the last apostle. And then we have this written, basically like a commentary tradition of the early church fathers, which are explicating and unfolding that initial deposit over the centuries through their commentary tradition. In Islam, we have what's known as the Hadith, and the Hadith come about basically as a need. So, in the Orthodox telling of this, Orthodox Muslim telling of this, the Quran is, it's supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to be the everything that you need, but as we know, it's a very relatively short work. It's shorter than the New Testament. And a lot of questions arise, a lot of need for interpretation. So what would happen is people would come to Muhammad with their questions, and he would expound upon what he believed. He's the final prophet, so his interpretation of the Quran is the exemplar. And so these clarifications that he gives are going to be much like the Quran itself was handed down orally. And eventually what happens is they want to have them all collected. And by the time that you get to the collection of them, it's a massive, massive project. Over time, the hadith get longer and longer and longer because questions would come up. Hey, what about this or what about that? And even after the death of Muhammad, a follower would say, oh, yeah, this particular problem, this particular situation or scenario that you need some moral guidance on or some kind of way to resolve the problem. Oh, yeah, we happen to have asked Muhammad about that, and this is what he said. So that collection becomes known as the Hadith of basically the sayings and doings of Muhammad, and they are rated. There's approximately four different accepted Hadith, and they're rated on a series of how reliable they are. So the reliability is the ones that they're most certain of, they would call authentic. Then there's dubious, then there's weak, and then there's fake. Now, they had a whole standard of transmission about how they would accept that which was authentic, dubious, or weak. That's a whole story in and of itself, but they have a method. There's a method to how they would go about testing the reliability of hadith. For example, when you go to this person and you get them to recite the hadith, the sayings that they memorized and kept, could they tell you who they got them from? And could that person be traced back to this person who could be traced to Muhammad, right? So there's a line of communication that could be followed there. Hierarchy in Islam. So in the Catholic Church, we have a very clear and institutionalized hierarchy. We have the Holy See, and then we have the bishops who are in union with the Pope, and they can come together in certain bodies like councils or synods. And the Holy See and the bishops in union with the Pope are able to give definitive teachings on the church. And we have a whole grades of certainty ourselves for how we are to read these teachings. In Islam, there is the ulama. It's based more on a consensus, a more democratic approach. And so what you have is you have these bodies of scholars, and when the scholars come to some kind of general consensus, this is what the orthodox, I'm using this word very loosely, the orthodox understanding of certain Islamic beliefs and practices comes from. And of course, some bodies of scholars are going to be more influential than others. But there is no really definitive teaching body in Islam in the same way that you would have in the Catholic Church. Islam is a little bit more decentralized in the same way that, say, broadly speaking, Protestantism is or Judaism is. So this is the challenge when we're discussing Islam, is that for any given subject that I could say something positive, Islam believes this or Islam says this, you're going to find a lot of disagreement to that positive statement. So it makes it a very difficult religion to discuss in that sense. So what are the schools of thought? Well, as I said, in the church we have a tradition of commentary, we have a tradition of systematic theology, beginning really with the centuries, going through the early church fathers, and then in a systemized way culminating with the scholastics. And when you read this schools of thought in this tradition, they're largely going to be concerned with theology in the true sense of the word, right? Christians are heavily concerned with the mysteries of God. We write about the Trinity, the incarnation, salvation. We're heavily interested in all of these things because of the implications of the life and death of resurrection of Jesus Christ. So it forces us, and then like with the life of Christ, when you read the New Testament, Christ says these things where he's clearly inviting the reader to have a conversation about the nature and persons of God. In Islam, it's different. In Islam, the tradition is called the madhab. And what it means is that you're going to have four schools of really what's the primary concern, which is jurisprudence. And those main schools are going to be Hanafi, Maliki, Salafi, and Hanbali. And you may have heard of some of these before. And what I mean by jurisprudence is, unlike the Christian tradition, Islam is not so much worried about questions of God's nature. Now, that's not to say, again, there's exceptions to all of this. But if you were to weigh the vast majority of the written tradition, it's a lot of concern about law more than questions about God. It's not what must you believe, it is more what must you do. The things that you're to believe about God are very simple. That God is one, that he's all powerful, all knowing, and that's the gist of it. What you must do, we have a lot to say about what you must do. How you are to pray, how you are to dress, how you're to treat your wife. Okay? And so when you take these schools, these Islamic schools of jurisprudence, and you apply them, little pop quiz here. Does anybody know what those schools of law and practice are called? It's a word that I'm sure you've probably all heard of because it's a dirty word in Western media. It's called Sharia, right? It's the Sharia law. It's the application of one of these schools of jurisprudence. All right, so what are what I'm calling the visible signs? What are the signs that this person is a Christian? What is the signs that a person is a Muslim? In Christians, we get what I call our creedal signs. We have a statement of faith, the what we believe, right? This is our creedal declarations, our professions of faith. From those professions of faith, we also have a participation in a unified series of sacraments. In the Catholic Church, we have 7 of them, and those sacraments are administered under the rule of pastors, legitimate pastors, and we know their legitimacy through their communion with bishops, especially bishops who are in communion with the Roman pontiff. In Islam, you have what are known as the five pillars. And so the five pillars are first the Shahada. This is a kind of their own creedal statement where they'll say that there is no God but God and that Muhammad is Muhammad is a prophet of God. And when you recite this, you are effectively reciting yourself. As far as they're concerned, there has to be a intent there as well too. It's not just the recitation of the words. You have to mean what you are saying. But once you recite the Shahada with intent, you are initiated basically into Islam. It's a very easy religion to get into. It's a very difficult religion to get out of. So, but besides Muhammad, besides believing that there's no God but God and that Muhammad is the prophet of God, you also have to believe certain things. You should be believing certain things about angels and demons, about the final judgment. I do believe that there is, roughly speaking, if we were to qualify in Orthodox Islam, it's not as simple as there is no God but God and Muhammad being a prophet. I think there's clearly more to it that they're asked of, but typically they will limit it to the Shahada, which is essentially like their own creed. And the first part of that creed, in fact, Christians can really agree with the first part of it, right? We would say the same thing. There is no God but God. It's the second part of their creed that we have a problem with. The second pillar is the salat, which is the prayer. And this surprises a lot of people who aren't familiar with it, but Islamic prayer is actually very liturgical. It's, if you take the time to look at how they do, it's not like you don't just sit down. It's not just me and my Bible and having a word with God, right? They don't just sit down and pray. It's not this sort of ejaculatory prayers where you're whatever comes to your heart. There's very clear rubrics, very clear body postures and prostrations, and all of these things are heavily regulated. So it's a very liturgical religion in that sense. You have the zakat, which is a requirement to give a certain amount of alms. You have the swam, which is fasting, particularly in the period that's known as Ramadan. And then you have the Hajj, which is for every able-bodied person to make every able-bodied man to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, to the Kaaba, at some point in their life. So, yeah, if you do these five things, you are effectively a Muslim. And this is why when you see, there's this idea that you used to hear, you don't hear it so much anymore, but you would hear this idea of a radical Islam or something like that. And I found it to be a bit disingenuous for the simple fact that Islam it's not comparable to Christianity in the sense that Christianity, there's clear lines of excommunication, especially Catholic Christianity, clearer lines of excommunication and these types of things. But in Islam, basically, you're allowed a lot of maneuverability in terms of what you believe and don't believe. I would say the number one thing is the first pillar. If you hold to that first pillar, it's hard for somebody else to call you, oh, what do they call it? I think it's called takfir, right? Where they announce it's very taboo in Islam for another Muslim to denounce for one Muslim to denounce another Muslim as not being a Muslim, because the limitations on what constitutes being a Muslim are so easy to meet. The bar is so easy to meet that getting in is not that difficult. So this is why I say this idea of radical Islam is silly, because if you follow these five things, essentially you are Muslim. And so this is why somebody like, I don't care whether it's a bin Laden or it's your neighbor Ahmed, they're both Muslims, right? They're two very different people. Your neighbor Ahmed's probably a decent family guy, whatever, and seems like a nice enough guy when you talk to him, and he probably is. And then you've got somebody that's like the true radical bin Laden. But I don't think that identifying it as a radical Islam or radical Muslim is much of a helpful demarcation. But that actually does get me to the final one. This there's this question among Islamic scholars as to whether there is a sixth pillar in Islam. So this is the question. I think it's fair to say that jihad is something of an unofficial pillar. And it may even be fair to say that while it is a pillar, in other words, an imperative on the part of the Muslim believer, it's also not universally recognized as being martial, especially not martial in spirit alone, or maybe even primarily. And what I mean by that is a lot of the scholars will say that jihad is an internal battle for one's soul. Orthodox Islam believes that in the eschaton, they believe in a final judgment. And while there is no sacerdotal aspect to this, as in Christianity, the individual Muslim will face account for their deeds in this life. How did they pray? How much did they tithe? Did they tend to widows and orphans? But it would be anachronistic to simply apply a more moderated and modern reading on jihad as filtered through the post-Enlightenment world. In its day, there was a military martial component to jihad, the external struggle against the infidels. But even then, there were strict regulations on it, at least in theory. For example, you couldn't just call a jihad. You needed the consent of the ulama, as well as you needed the authority of the caliph, who is historically seen as the only one capable of calling for an offensive jihad. And this holds up to this day, even among the radicals who would want to apply this kind of Ibn Taymiyyah view to Islamic polity, even someone like Osama bin Laden. If you read his letters and listen to his audios, he was always very clear that his was a defensive jihad, which are easier to call. A defensive jihad to protect those lands which had already been brought under Dar al-Islam, which is different than calling for an offensive jihad. And he was explicit that he believed that there could be no offensive jihad since the last caliph was toppled after World War I. Now, bin Laden did say it was the goal of the jihadists to bring about the conditions for the return of the caliph, and then one day there could be an offensive jihad again, but that was not the immediate goals of those insurgent movements. And this brings me to a point I could mention now. I do plan to cover, as I did in my series on Jews in the Church, a difference between the ethical systems of Islam and Catholicism. That's probably going to be in the next one, but it's worth noting here because I don't think many Westerners appreciate that Islam, believe it or not, had a major pacifying effect on the Bedouins. People today see the violence and the expansive zeal for conquest. They see what to them, for both Christians at the time and especially for us today, seems like pretty barbaric practices. But if you know about tribal warfare in Arabia before the advent of Islam, it was pretty brutal, folks. Cutthroat. It was petty. Women and children were basically less than livestock. It was very clannish. It was all the kinds of things that you think Islam is. But in reality, Islam comes along with the Quran, with the Hadith, and says, we're not going to play like that anymore. And it places very strict regulations on warfare, on how it's to be conducted. Going back to bin Laden was a student of his history. He knew these things well. When he addresses America in his declaration of war, he's following all the prescriptions of his faith. He's giving a declaration of war. He asks the president, President Clinton in that case, in the declaration, he asks him to convert to Islam, because in Islam, you must give the enemy the opportunity to convert. If they convert, then you're not to kill them. He then bullet points his grievances. In Islam, you must allow your opponent to correct or at least address the grievances that you have with them. He goes to the religious body, bin Laden does, and gets permission. In Islam, you are supposed to get a fatwa from the religious authorities who they will say this is what your stated objective is. This is the amount of people it is permissible to die in the course of this objective. It's an attempt to minimize bloodshed. That's an whatever it is to see the objective through, the limitations of what you're able to do, and so on and so forth. A lot of people miss this. They say, look, even with all of that, I still find Islam pretty barbaric. And that may be especially by today's standards, but in comparison to 7th century Arabian clannish warfare, it's like the Enlightenment came upon them. It really is a night and day thing, because when you're dealing with desert tribal warfare and the brutality of it, even the what seem still pretty wild limitations of Islam was still a pretty drastic change compared to what was. Another thing about jihad is that it's not always given priority. We see it at times going dormant in the Islamic world and then exploding violently again. All right, so that's my overview. I want to move now to the collapse of the Umayyad dynasty. This, as we said, was the first caliphate in Islam after the death of Muhammad and the first four successors, the so-called rightly guided ones. The Umayyad dynasty is situated, it's headquartered in Damascus. It finds itself flushed with victory, wealth, power, beyond anyone's wildest dreams. And now they have what is effectively, for the time, the largest landmass empire in the world. And they last 89 years. Not very long. So how did they manage to squander all of that success, you ask? It's simple. According to their opponents, anyways, they got fat on the hog. They let the temptation to all of that wealth get to their head, and in the process abandoned the moral imperative to wage jihad against infidel lands. As I said, jihad comes and goes in waves, and we can see this as a waxing of the crest here. And how does that happen? As we noted, the Islamic conquest, that initial thrust was lightning fast, very rapid. An interesting thing about the Umayyad period is that they don't leave us with much to work with in the sources. The only thing that we can say with certainty about them is that they lived very well. They built palaces, they built complex systems of irrigation and transport. They set up very fertile land tracts, also that they could just live it up, as it were. And as you can imagine, if you're a Muslim at the time and you're looking at your hadith and you're looking at the life of the Prophet, and then you're looking at the lives of these people are living, it made some Muslims mad, the sort of contradiction and the hypocrisy. And so this resentment spills over into revolution, and in 740, the Umayyads are overthrown by a group known as the Abbasids. And this becomes what's known as the Abbasid Empire, the second great caliphate in Islamic history. The Abbasid Empire begins with a man named Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, who is a direct descendant of Muhammad. He wasn't a close enough relative to please the Shiites, but he does win the affection of this upswell of pious sentiment, which emerged in the wake of Umayyad decadence. When the Abbasids take power, they go about murdering all of the Umayyad leaders with the exception of one man. This man, Abdallah Rahman the First. This is one of those men of history who just led an extraordinary life. But it almost wasn't. So Al-Rahman is the grandson of the Caliph Hisram ibn Abd al-Malik. And when the Abbasids set about massacring all of the remnant royal family, Al-Rahman astonishingly hears the massacres going on down the hallway in the palace that he's at. And thanks to a loyal servant, he's able to slip out under the cover of night and he gets to Damascus. But the Abbasids are aware of his escape and they send people to pursuit. They're on his trail, and so that he must leave, he's got to flee the Levant. He flees into Egypt, across the North African desert, with a well-known bounty on his head the whole time, which may not have been so bad had not Al-Rahman also had a uniquely red hair, which in the Middle East kind of made you stand out. He had red hair, in fact, because his mother had been a Berber Christian. So because of this ethnic discrepancy in his blood, he had red hair, and he also happened to stand about a foot taller than the average Arab. So you're trying to escape for your life, and you probably stand out like a sore thumb. But it's a wild journey. At one point, Abdallah Rahman and his servant, they jump into a riverbank with the Abbasid henchmen right on their trail. They jump into the river and they're trying to swim across, but it's a very treacherous swim. They get about midway and they look back, and the horsemen are on the bank saying, "Come back, come back. We'll only apprehend you." So the servant turns and goes back and he gets to the shore, and the men immediately pull out their swords and chop the guy's head off and then hold it up and show it to Al-Rahman, who is waiting in the river looking at them. So logically, he says, I think I'm going to take my chances with the current. And so it's a harrowing escape by all accounts the whole way. Remarkably, what ends up happening is that Al-Rahman gets to Spain in about 756 at the perfect time for a displaced royal member to arrive, because at that moment in Spain, there is an internal division among the Arab and North African Berber Muslims. The problem is that the Arabs tended, and they still tend, to treat anyone not Arab as inferior. And all the Berbers alongside them here in the Al-Andalus come to resent that. Al-Rahman is in a unique place. On the one hand, he's the grandson of an Arab who had direct lineage back to the Prophet, while on the other, his mother was a Berber herself. So this leads to one of the most unique turn of events in all of human history, because while the entire Umayyad Caliphate has just collapsed and been utterly destroyed and eliminated, and its capital in Damascus has been moved by the Abbasids to Baghdad, setting up a new caliphate. Here in Spain, by the sheer coincidence of timing and by the sheer miracle of his survival, the Umayyad dynasty continues on. And this is going to be very important for the future of the Reconquista, as we will see. One of the important features is that he does something unique, and he announces himself the Emir and calls his empire the Emirate, which is basically a way to differentiate himself from the Caliphate, because as Emir, it's a way of linking himself directly to the Prophet's bloodline, unlike those usurper Abbasids back east. Now in time, this would change when in 929, Abd al-Rahman III and his heirs began to call themselves caliphs, taking for themselves the title of the ruler of Muslims worldwide. And this is important because effectively what you have is two rival Orthodox Sunni powers, both claiming legitimacy, both in opposition to one another. And as we will see, Islamic Spain will ever be a thorn in the side of the main body of Muslim power in the East. oftentimes finding themselves more at odds with them than they ever were with their Christian neighbors to the north. So history is a very unexpected and interesting thing, is it not? All right, so let's turn for just a minute and focus our attention to the Christian Spain and what's going on there. We're going to have some important developments in the events, especially as it comes to historically framing this thing that we call the Reconquista. Up to this point, the Christians are left licking their wounds. They've lost the vast majority of the Iberian Peninsula. They're huddled up in the inhospitable far north. The rest are directly under the heavy yoke of the caliphate. And even while the heroes of the north did sustain this remnant Christian society, it's not this unified cause to fortify their wins, let alone to advance offensively back onto the enemy. The first hint that this is going to change happens with this man, though, King Alfonso II of Asturias. So let's look a little at his life and contributions. First off, very wisely, I must say, he sets out to reach beyond the immediate factionalism of the Asturias by seeking alliances with the Carolingian Empire and the papacy, which he manages to secure, turning this local concern into an international struggle. Charlemagne's court, after all, is the universal temporal power of the age, and of course, the papacy is the universal spiritual power. The papacy from this point forward would have a very vested interest in Spain. Not that they hadn't before, they certainly had, but from here on, it's going to be like a intentional orientation toward a unified, to use a later word, a unified crusade, which is ultimately what the Reconquista becomes. So the popes, long before even a unified Spanish identity emerges, would be seizing upon this inclination. Alfonso is a very religious man, so he's raised in the monastery in San Julian de Samos. He's declared king in September 14th, 791 at Pravia, the capital. But then he moves the capital to Oviedo, the city of his birth, and he sets about building churches there. Then in 794, Amir al-Rahman initiates a series of raids upon the north, and Alfonso ultimately is successful in defeating two Muslim armies, both at Neron and Anzio, and then he goes about keeping with this policy of repopulation. He ends up repopulating parts of Galicia, Leon, and Castile with Christians, and continuing this policy of his namesake, Alfonso I. But he's in need of a sort of moral center. The whole thing is in need of a moral center, a rallying cry which would unify the Christian subjects under him, not just to the immediate concerns, but what I am convinced that maybe even he himself recognizes as a cause greater than himself, even if he couldn't have articulated it yet as such. And so what happens is what many historians see as a turning point in the self-identity of a unified cause. The story of this leads to one of the most famous medieval pilgrimages, the Santiago de Compostela, which many of you, I am sure, have heard of or have visited even, as to this day it's still a very popular pilgrimage destination. So what happens is that a Bishop Theodomir of Iria, gets word that there are these mysterious lights emanating from the sky near the Labradon forest. So he goes to investigate, and he finds there a stone sepulchre with the remains of three men, one of which is believed to be the bones of St. James the Apostle. The convergence of this discovery coincided with both the papacy and the Carolingian court recognizing Alphonsus II's legitimate reign. And by the 10th century, this shrine would receive further importance when Leon begins to emerge as a political power, which we will discuss next time. So the finding of the relics at this moment would go on to have a profound impact on the future of all Christian Spain. And I don't think it's possible yet to say, hey, unified cause here, but also we shouldn't just underestimate the effect that this is going to have, as medieval people could be immensely inspired by their saints' relics, this being one of the most famous examples in all of history. I want to turn now to what's going on inside Muslim-occupied Spain for the Christians there. And the first thing we want to make note of is this idea of the demi-status or dimitude. This is a universally recognized practice within Dar al-Islam where Christians are kept in a perpetual state of subjugation. It's right there in the Quran. Christians are referred to as people of the book. They're not scorned per se, but they are held to be of an inferior status unless they were to submit to Allah and accept Muhammad as a prophet. And it's truly an awful place to be as a Christian. Granted, it could be worse, like under the Bolsheviks, but where the Bolsheviks carry out mass extermination, Muslims just tighten the noose ever tighter around the Christian community's necks. It may take centuries. In the immediate, they may even protect their Christian minorities, but over time, demi-status begins to take its toll. And this is wholly intentional, folks. I would recommend Bat Yeor's work on the decline of the Christian East if you're interested in this subject. I'm not in complete agreement with her, but she does do groundbreaking work examining how bad dimitude really was. And is, for that matter. There's still Christians who live in demi status. So what happens in Cordoba is that a bishop, Bishop Eulogius, begins to chide his fellow bishops for their servile capitulation to dimitude. And his rhetoric and his preaching begins to touch the hearts of the Christian community, and they begin to rebel against the status quo. They know it is clear, the Muslims make it clear, it's a known factor what this action will get you. So in a real sense, by not complying, you are accepting martyrdom. So we get a series of martyrs, and each one really, guys, just has its own very unique and moving hagiography. I really recommend taking the time to look at them. But just a couple examples. There's one case, a young woman who was she was the child of a mixed marriage. She had secretly been raised Christian, though. So she goes on to become a nun living in a convent, and when word gets out that she's actually an apostate because one of her parents being Muslim, she's brought to the authorities. Now the authorities, they're going to try to make a little bit of clemency. They say, look, just tell us that you're Muslim and we'll let you go. We'll even let you go back to the convent. Just tell us that you're a Muslim. And she says, no, Jesus is God. So they behead her and they throw her body in the river. There's another case where a priest decides that he is going to run through the streets of Cordova, telling everyone that Jesus is the Son of God. He's going to shout it as loud as he can. He's going to run as fast as he can. And he was going to tell as many people as he could before the authorities could catch him. So he does this. He's running through the city. They can't catch him, so he's going through all the streets and the back alleys screaming that Jesus is the Son of God. And eventually they do catch him, and they cut his head off, and they throw his body into the river. And there's numerous stories like this. I want to say that there's over 50. And as you can imagine, it really just captures the minds and the hearts of Christians, both in the Al-Andalus, but also those outside who will remember and keep the cult of these martyrs alive for centuries. Now let's discuss this new culture which emerges out of the ashes of Visigothic Spain. From the time of the arrival of the Moors onward, they begin to call the land Al-Andalus, which means the land of the Vandals or land of the barbarians. The Arabs, like the Greeks, had a tendency to view everyone, not them, as barbarian. So we're talking a 700-year-long establishment here. They were, for all intents and purposes, the owners of the land, rightfully by conquest. I'm not saying that prescriptively, of course. My opinion is that it's better to have Spain or North Africa or the Levant, for that matter, Christian than Muslim. But descriptively, it's just a fact. It was rightly theirs. They conquered it. They were able to control it for 700 years, and there emerges out of that a unique, distinct culture of the Al-Andalus, which gives rise to something not found elsewhere in Europe, not found in North African Islam and the Levantine Islam. It was a Spanish European, and I'm loosely saying European, but a Spanish European Islamic culture. So let's talk about it. There are many different factors which make up a culture, and we could easily spend the whole lecture going into detail. Now, I do plan in the next lecture to look at some of the aspects of the Al-Andalus in greater detail, but for now, just as an overview to introduce you to it, I chose four different segments of the culture to look at. For one, language. The Al-Andalus was a remarkably multilingual era. Classical Arabic, of course, served as the lingua franca of administration, scholarship, of poetry, of high culture. But there was also a vernacular, Al-Andalusi, an Arabic vernacular, which was spoken widely. Then there was the Mozarabic, the Al-Andalusi Romance language, which persisted primarily, almost exclusively among the Christians, which made use of made heavy use. It's almost like a Norman English, but it makes heavy use of Arabic loanwords. And then there's Latin, which remains the sort of liturgical language of the Christians. Hebrew is going to be the language of the Jewish communities and scholars. And then there's going to be various Berber dialects among the North African settlers. And then Arabic is the sort of lingua franca across the faiths. As far as beliefs and values, in Spain, Islam, of course, is going to form the dominant framework, and this would be heavily forced and regulated by the ulama. The emphasis then is on monotheism, on scholarly pursuits, and because of the royal dynasty, there is also a unique Syrian Umayyad tradition that, like I said, we don't know much about the Umayyads themselves, but a remnant of it we are able to say something about because it does survive in this Al-Andalus world. As far as toleration goes, it's a heavily mixed bag, which we'll discuss in a moment. Tolerance towards the dhimmis, Jews and Christians, allows a degree of religious autonomy, though it's heavily taxed and heavily regulated. And then meanwhile, Sharia is going to be enforced for Muslims. The Al-Andalusian people prized knowledge and education. There was a cultural emphasis on poetry, much like in most Arabic-speaking cultures. And I would add also that there was a high courtly culture, not unlike what you'd find in later high medieval Europe. This is a period where philosophical rationalism comes into its own with Averroes, and it coexists somewhat comfortably with Islamic orthodoxy. And the Jews of the Sephardic Jews of the region in particular, thrived in this space of scholarship and finance and medicine, and we touched upon a lot of that in our last series. The society is going to be heavily hierarchized with Arab elites at the top, followed by the Berbers, Then your sort of local converts to Islam who would eventually make up the majority. Then there's the Mozarabs, the Arabized Christians, and then finally there's the Jews. Slavery is going to play a huge role in the emergence of the Arab slave trade. In the Al-Andalus, the primary source of slaves would have come from the northern Iberian Peninsula among the Christians, but they also traded heavily in North African and sub-Saharan African slaves. The mosques and libraries that they built are world famous, and they would serve at the time as community centers. The daily life of your average Muslim in the Al-Andalus would have been pretty good for the standards of the days. It would have mixed various cultural norms of typical life for Muslims, prayer. They would have practiced Ramadan. They would have kept to halal, with the various local adaptations, of course. And then there's going to be a huge importance placed among the upper class, as I noted, on a sort of courtly etiquette, which they become well known for, and it included refined dining. They were known for their three-course meals and their very elaborate table settings. You find a lot of art, Christian artwork in particular, that sort of romanticizes this, the sort of luxurious lifestyle that they would have led in fashion and cosmetics. The music, right? The guitar comes from this period. So they're known for their festivals, their poetry recitals, their public baths. And these were central to the lifestyle cultivated in the beautiful land of the Vandals, which they had conquered. Closely related to that, they were also renowned for their Romanesque to Islamic fusion in arts and architecture. Like I said, these are world famous. The horseshoe arches, the highly intricate staccato tiles and gardens, and many of these you can still find there today. As I said, as far as arts and cultures go, poetry plays heavily into the culture, but also literature, philosophy, science and advanced medicine, astronomy, mathematics. There was, very important to us in the West, a huge transmission of the ancient knowledge via translations, Greek to Arabic to Latin, and then the libraries, and then the scholars of all the various faiths, which are eventually going to transmit over into Europe and have a profound effect on Christendom. Looking to our discussion here of Muslims and the church in the Middle Ages, I'd also want to make this point and look at not just what's going on with the Muslims in the Al-Andalus, but let's look at this Christian culture that emerges in it as well. So to clarify, the Mozarabic Christians are not part of the northern free kingdoms. Later, there would be some back and forth, and the Mozarabic would sometimes find themselves in Christian hands when the city that they were in, for example, would have been recaptured by the Christians. But by and large, the Mozarabic people are a people in the culture are formed distinctly in within the context of the Islamic Caliphate in Spain. They are a subject people. One thing I used to be confused about myself was that I thought that they were ethnically Arab Christians who came along with the Arabs and the Jews as they migrated from the east into Spain, but that's actually not the case. Instead, they are the living remnants of the Visigothic Spaniards who were left in the conquered. Like we said, some of them were pushed north, but some of them stayed in Iberia, and so they made up their own distinct phenotype. So you'd at least early on, you'd have been able to tell them apart based on look alone. Though eventually, over time, they are melded and blended into the wider culture, and they'd have spoken Arabic, they'd have partaken of many of the same customs and traditions that we were just discussing in the last slide. Now, the demi-status they'd have been subjected to was not easy, especially for the Christians. The Jews managed to eke out their survival okay, but there is evidence that the Mozarabs faced upwards of 50% loss to conversions over the course of the 700 years. When you've got a retention rate of 50%, and a 50% loss to Islam over a course of centuries, then you're not really batting the best average there. I think besides the heavy taxation that they faced, this is an important thing to emphasize at the end here. Besides the heavy taxation that they faced, exclusion from important parts of society, they couldn't build or repair churches. Their children were heavily proselytized to, and as a parent, you had no right to stop that. And then, of course, there's going to be strict laws around the sexes. Muslim men could marry Christian daughters, take them for wives. Christian men could not marry Muslim women. The children of Muslim men and Christian wives had to be raised Muslim. There were restrictions for Christians on their dress, on their travel, on the right of fair trial if the accused was a Muslim. So all of this is very important because there's just the fact that at times, as we will see in the next lecture, persecutions would ramp up and life would become largely intolerable for those under this umbrella that we call Mozambique Christianity. Because there's this notion, I say it's important because there's this notion among secular historians, especially post Gibbons, where they want to portray Visigothic Spain, but especially the reemergence of Christian Spain, as the most barbaric and brutal of places, while the enlightened Islamic Spain was a paradise of culture and elegance. This is now highly contested. Look, I'm not gonna sit here and say that there wasn't an objective greatness to the Al-Andalus, much like there's an objective greatness to the Roman Empire. There certainly was in many ways, but the reality for the Christian, both in the northern free Christian areas and the dhimmi Christians within Dar al-Islam, life is not a paradise for them. It was uncertain. If you were living within the realm of the Al-Andalus, it was persecuted. It was ever close to being wiped out by the slow vice grip of Islamic servitude. For a controversial yet I think groundbreaking treatment of this subject, see Dario Fernandez Moreira's Myth of the Al-Andalusian Paradise. He, in my opinion, really breached that Gibbon myth of the paradisial land of the Vandals. One thing to bear in mind about all of this, the Mozarab Christians did see themselves as Al-Andalusian. And it's unfortunate, but they were often fighting alongside Muslims in their battles against Christians, especially in the northern kingdoms. So we have to keep that in mind if we're thinking about this unified thing we call the Reconquista. As we'll see especially in the next lecture, it's often the case in those early centuries that Christians fought Christians on behalf of Muslims, or just in their petty internal squabbles as much as they fought with the Muslims. So again, the idea of an unbroken continuity has to be challenged. One example of how that plays out in the wider theological context, there was actually a Spanish adoptionist heresy which broke out in the 8th century, which was heavily refuted by the Frankish Carolingian court, especially by Alcuin of York, though there is some disagreement about how much the Spanish believed of what they were accused of by the Franks. All right, now to wind this lecture down and to bring us to the juncture from the first to the second lectures, I want to introduce you to Al-Manzur. So you're going to find in this story, and in the story of Islam in general, that there are these long periods of settling in, resting on your laurels, petty squabbling, luxurious living, which are then met usually by the emergence of a military figure who comes along and shakes everybody and wakes them up out of their slumber. This was the Abbasids, this was Saladin, this was bin Laden, and this too is al-Mansur. So who is he? Al-Mansur, born Muhammad ibn Abi Amir in 938. He's born into an Arab family who has roots which trace back to the original conquest of Iberia. He's a very brilliant man, I'd say right up there with Saladin as far as Islam goes, though he never garnered the attention of the Western mind in the way that Saladin did, mostly because of Saladin's association with the loss of the Holy Land. Manzar rose rapidly through the Umayyad administration in Cordoba as a civil servant, as a letter writer. By 978, he had secured for himself the position of Hajib, or chancellor. And in this role, he becomes the de facto ruler of the Caliphate of Cordoba for over 2 decades, while effectively reducing the caliph to a ceremonial figurehead. He exercised supreme political, military, and administrative power. He heavily centralized authority, and he set about reforming the army, which he would then turn upon the north. He had his sights on the north because, as we said, Christians had been repopulating the border areas. So by the mid to late 10th century, beginning with King Alfonso II, the Christian kingdoms of the north, especially Leon, Castile, and Navarre, had oversaw this systematic repopulation and fortification of the frontier zones south of the Cantabrian Mountains and along the Duero River Valley. Later kings such as Ordonov I and Alfonso III encouraged settlers to occupy those depopulated and contested lands, to establish towns and monasteries and defensive outposts. And this gradual southward expansion created a more populated and economically viable Christian frontier, even with various buffer zones between the Christians and the Islamic frontier. So this begins putting pressure on the border regions of the Al-Andalus, both militarily and economically. Now, Al-Mansur was a deeply religious man with a strong personal commitment to Islamic orthodoxy and the concept of jihad as an armed struggle. His whole career, he's cultivating these close ties with the religious scholars of Cordoba, and he's performing these highly publicized pious acts, such as personally copying the Quran. He's cultivating this self-image as a mujahideen, that is one who wages jihad. And keep in mind, this zeal was not merely political. He integrated religious devotion into his governance and his personal conduct. And by all accounts, as I said, he was known by others as a very pious man. He seems to have genuinely been motivated by this religious impulse, which was recognized by others around him, and whom he managed to inspire. And as I was saying earlier about jihad, there are long dormant periods of it, which is why it's questionable, is it the sixth pillar or not? But when the right Muslim ruler comes along and reminds the faithful that they had this duty to defend and expand the frontiers of Islam against the Christian polities of the north, and this encroaching presence, which presents a real existential threat, when that ruler comes along, as Al-Mansur does, men are going to react. So Al-Mansur frames his military activity as a religious obligation, and he invokes the concept of jihad to rally his forces and legitimize his authority. The northern Christian kingdoms aren't merely political rivals, but they represent a threat to Dar al-Islam. And the whole idea, I've said it several times, the word, I haven't really explained it yet, but the whole idea of Dar al-Islam is that once land has been conquered for Allah, there's never any going back, ever, as far as the Muslims concerned. So Christians repopulating land that had been handed over to Allah was a major anathema and taboo. And Muslims all over have an obligation at that point. It's a defensive jihad. And they've pushed this notion of Dar al-Islam. And even when you read, going again all the way, I bring up bin Laden because he's a modern figure, but when you read the words of bin Laden, he sees Spain and he sees Israel both as Dar al-Islam. And so to take Spain and to take Israel actually in his mind was not seen as a offensive jihad, but rather defensive because it had already been given to Allah. Now let's look at his campaigns. So you'll notice up there in the yellow, this looks a lot different than where we left off. Remember I said at the beginning that we'll want to pay attention to the maps here. The way this push southward by the northern kingdoms comes about, not so much the military conquest, but by the fact that most Muslims gravitated to the south, to Granada, to Cordoba, or Toledo. The north culturally was not going to be of much interest to the Muslims. I'm talking about the northern ends, the northern parts of the frontier for them, not even the north as in the Christian kingdoms, but the north, the northern borders of their the Al-Andalus. Culturally, physically, it's not really something they're primarily concerned with. So it becomes this thing where it belongs more to the Al-Andalus on paper than reality. And in its depopulation, in that move of Muslims abandoning it and heading further south, this is what the Christian princes have seized upon. So this is how they gain from that little tract of land up in the far north to almost the entire, well, really the entirety of the north of Iberia. So they intentionally place, the Christians do, their own subjects into those regions that border along the Al-Andalus, knowing that eventually what was de facto would become de jure. And this is precisely what Almanzor saw. Now, at this time, there were back and forth, a sort of back and forth series of ransoms known as tributes. And tributes is a nice way of saying extortion money. Muslims, when they had the advantage, did this, as did Christians. Everybody would exact tributes where they could. At this time, the kingdom of Pamplona and the county of Barcelona were subjected to an annual tribute that they had to pay to, quote unquote, recognize Cordoba's sovereignty. Hey guys, here's your money showing that we recognize that you own the land way far down there in the south. Well, as you can imagine, business was bad this year, boss. Sorry, we can't really pay the tribute. And that could go one of two ways, typically depending on who was in control. One option, if you're in control, you ignore their insolvency and you run the risk of delegitimizing your claim to sovereignty, which was more common than you would think because under feckless leaders who wouldn't want to risk sending armies to enforce those tributes, this was somewhat common. But the other option, too, you begin carrying out reprisal campaigns where you either harass or by harass, you'd send what we today call the goons up there to collect the money, or you could full on invade. Well, Almanzor, of course, was going to be the man who would go to collect debts, and he loved the excuse. It was a pretext for what he really wanted to do, which was to ignite a full-scale war against the North. And if you doubt me on that, he takes those occasional defaults as the excuse to launch about 60 different campaigns into the Christian North, covering the whole expanse of the borders between the Al-Andalus and the kingdoms of the North. And his idea was simple: give the enemy no quarter, no rest, no security, anywhere where their borders touched yours. And yet he went even further than that because he takes his armies deep into the Asturias to raid and to harass Christians, which is well even beyond the places that he goes is well beyond even the most conservatively recognized borders. Almanzor relied upon lightweight cavalry to keep his army highly mobile and rapid, and he admittedly did a number to the Christian resistance. For the immediate future of Christian Spain, this all meant that demographic loss of all those gains they had made. There was heavy economic strain, and of course the psychological blow that they could be touched. And that was going to delay any unified southward push by at least a few generations. And yet, those short-term victories paradoxically ended up accelerating the long-term recovery and resurgence of the Christian kingdoms. Almanzor's death on the campaign in 1002, combined with the enormous strains his war had placed on the caliphate, triggered a rapid collapse into civil war in the south. The northern Christian polities, though, were not permanently subjugated. In fact, Almanzor, because of his emphasis on mobility and rapidity, largely left his defeated unoccupied. His armies would come in, they would raid, and then they just move on to the next target. The Christians then used the breathing space to regroup, and this shift in power dynamics laid the groundwork for the renewed Christian offensive, ultimately transforming their humiliation by Almanzor into the decisive turning point that propelled the Reconquista forward. And this is where we're going to pick up next time. For now, please subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we will see you in the next lecture. God bless.